Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. The desert heat made everything shimmer like water, turning distant objects into dancing mirages. Through her scope, she could see the small village of Al-Rashid spread out below their position on the rocky hillside. What should have been a routine patrol had turned into something much more dangerous. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Miller, lay beside her with his binoculars pressed to his eyes. They had been watching the village for 2 hours now, ever since their convoy had been forced to take shelter here after an improvised explosive device destroyed the lead vehicle. The blast had killed 2 soldiers instantly and wounded 3 others. Now their entire unit was trapped, unable to move forward or retreat safely. Movement in the blue building, 2nd floor, east window, Miller whispered into his radio. His voice carried the tension they all felt. The blue building sat at the center of the village, its faded paint peeling in the harsh sun. It offered a perfect view of the main road where their convoy sat disabled. Santos shifted her position slightly, bringing the M24 sniper rifle to bear on the window Miller had indicated. Through her scope, she caught a brief glimpse of something dark moving behind the window frame. Not enough to confirm a target, but enough to know they were being watched. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through their radio. Overwatch, we've got multiple wounded down here. Medical evacuation helicopter is 20 minutes out, but we need that landing zone secure. Can you see any threats from your position? Santos keyed her radio. Possible sniper position in the blue building, sir. Still confirming. Village appears mostly empty, but I'm seeing movement in several structures. The truth was more complicated than her report suggested. Santos had been watching this village for hours now, and something felt wrong. The streets were too empty. In most Iraqi villages, there would be children playing, women hanging laundry, old men sitting in whatever shade they could find. This place looked abandoned, but the subtle signs of recent habitation were everywhere. Fresh footprints in the dust. Laundry still hanging on lines. Cooking fires that had been extinguished recently. Miller lowered his binoculars and glanced at her. They had worked together for 8 months now, and he could read her expressions almost as well as she could read wind patterns and bullet drop calculations. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "This whole thing stinks," she replied, never taking her eye from the scope. "That IED wasn't random. They knew we'd be on this road today, and now we're sitting here like ducks while they get into position." Santos had good reason to be suspicious. This was her 2nd deployment to Iraq, and she had learned to trust her instincts. During her first tour, overconfidence had nearly gotten her killed when her unit walked into an ambush that intelligence reports said was impossible. Since then, she approached every situation with careful paranoia. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, Santos had grown up in South Texas, where her father taught her to hunt deer in the brush country. She could make impossible shots with a rifle before she could drive a car. When she enlisted in the Army at 18, her drill instructors quickly recognized her natural shooting ability. After basic training, she was selected for sniper school, where she graduated 2nd in her class. But being a female sniper in the Army meant constantly proving herself. Even now, after dozens of confirmed kills and multiple commendations, some soldiers still questioned whether a woman belonged in this role. Santos had learned to let her rifle do the talking. In combat, results mattered more than opinions. "Contact left," Miller said suddenly. His binoculars were trained on a group of buildings about 400 meters to the east. 3 individuals moving between structures. They're carrying something. Santos swung her rifle toward the new target area. Through her scope, she could see 3 figures dressed in dark clothing moving quickly from one building to another. One of them was definitely carrying a rifle. As she watched, they disappeared into a 2-story structure with a clear view of the road below. "I've got eyes on 3 possible hostiles moving into position," she reported over the radio. "They're armed and positioning themselves to overlook our location." Captain Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Rules of engagement are in effect. You are authorized to engage any hostile targets threatening our position." Santos felt her heart rate slow down, the way it always did when she entered what she called her shooting zone. Everything became crystal clear. The heat, the noise, the chatter on the radio, it all faded into background static. There was only the target, the rifle, and the precise calculations needed to connect the two. She adjusted her scope for the distance and began reading the environmental conditions. The wind was light but variable, maybe 3 miles per hour from the southwest. The temperature was over 100 degrees, which would affect the bullet's trajectory slightly. The target was at a downward angle from her position, requiring a small adjustment to her aim point. Through her scope, she watched the building where the 3 figures had taken cover. After several minutes, one of them appeared at a window on the second floor. He was holding what looked like an AK-47 rifle and was scanning the area below where the American convoy sat disabled. "I have a confirmed hostile target," Santos reported. "Adult male, armed with rifle, second floor window of the tan building 400 meters east of our position." "Take the shot," Rodriguez replied immediately. Santos steadied her breathing and placed her crosshairs on the center of the target's chest. She took up the slack in her trigger, feeling for that perfect moment between heartbeats when everything aligned. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding hills. Through her scope, she saw the target drop from view immediately. Whether he was hit or had simply taken cover, she couldn't tell from this distance. But the message had been sent. The Americans on the hillside were not defenseless. "Target neutralized," she reported, though she wasn't certain of the kill. In sniper work, you rarely got confirmation unless you could physically check the body. Miller was already scanning for secondary targets. "Movement in the courtyard behind that building," he said. "Looks like they're repositioning." Santos worked the bolt on her rifle, chambering a fresh round. The sharp metallic sound of the action cycling was somehow reassuring. She had trained thousands of hours for moments like this, but real combat was always different from the shooting ranges back home. The radio crackled with updates from the convoy below. The wounded soldiers were being stabilized, but they needed that helicopter landing zone cleared and secured. Any enemy fighters in the village needed to be eliminated or driven off before the medical evacuation could proceed. "Sniper team, be advised we're seeing smoke signals from multiple positions around the village," Rodriguez reported. "Looks like they're coordinating something." Santos looked up from her scope and saw what he meant. Thin columns of smoke were rising from several locations around Al-Rashid. It was an old communication method, still effective in areas where radios might be monitored or jammed. The enemy was definitely organizing a response to the trapped American convoy. "They're calling in reinforcements," Miller said grimly. "We need to start thinning them out before this gets worse." Santos returned to her scope and began systematically scanning each building in the village. Her job was to find the threats before they could effectively engage the convoy below. But she was only one sniper with limited ammunition, facing an unknown number of enemy fighters who knew this terrain intimately. Through her scope, she caught movement in a building closer to the convoy position. Someone was setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun on a rooftop. The weapon would have devastating effects on the soldiers trapped below if it was allowed to open fire. "Priority target," she announced. "Heavy weapon emplacement, rooftop of the white building, 250 meters southeast." The target was partially concealed behind a low wall on the rooftop, making the shot more challenging. Santos would have to wait for the gunner to expose himself enough for a clean shot. In sniper work, patience was often more important than marksmanship skills. She settled in to wait, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her fellow soldiers lived or died. The enemy was moving into position, the helicopter was still 15 minutes away, and she was the only thing standing between her unit and a coordinated attack. The weight of responsibility felt familiar on her shoulders. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. In a few moments, she would have to prove once again that she belonged here, that her skills were worth the trust her commanders had placed in her. Santos adjusted her grip on the rifle and continued her watch over the village below. The real fight was just beginning. The machine gunner on the white building's rooftop made his first mistake 20 seconds later. He leaned out from behind his cover to get a better angle on the convoy below, exposing his upper torso for just a moment. It was all the opening Santos needed. She had been tracking his position through her scope, her crosshairs already positioned where she calculated he would appear. When he moved into the open, she was ready. The rifle cracked again, and this time she saw the target spin and fall backward out of sight. "Confirmed kill on the machine gun position," she reported. But there was no time to celebrate. Miller had identified another threat developing on the opposite side of the village. A group of fighters was moving through the narrow alleyways, apparently trying to get close enough to the convoy to use rocket-propelled grenades. "Multiple contacts moving west through the market area," Miller called out. "Count 6 individuals, armed, moving toward our people." Santos swung her rifle toward the new threat zone. The market area was a maze of small stalls and low buildings that provided plenty of concealment. She caught glimpses of the fighters as they moved between structures, but no clear shots presented themselves. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with increasing urgency. "Sniper team, we're starting to take small arms fire from multiple directions. We need those threats eliminated now." Santos could hear the distant pop of AK-47 rifles echoing through the valley. Bullets began striking the rocks around the convoy position below, forcing the soldiers to take whatever cover they could find. The wounded men were still exposed, unable to move to better positions. "I need a clear shot," Santos told Miller. "Can you spot for the market area?" Miller adjusted his position to get a better view of the western side of the village. Target coming into view now. Single fighter, northeast corner of the market, carrying RPG launcher. Santos found the target through her scope. A man in dark clothing was moving between the market stalls with a distinctive tube-shaped weapon across his shoulder. An RPG could destroy one of the convoy vehicles and kill everyone inside. This was a priority target that couldn't be allowed to get into firing position. The shot was more difficult than her previous engagements. The target was moving quickly and would only be visible for brief moments as he passed between the market stalls. Santos would have to time her shot perfectly to catch him in the open. She tracked his movement pattern, noting the rhythm of his advance from one concealed position to the next. Like most fighters, he was following a predictable pattern. 3 steps, pause, look around, then dash to the next cover. Santos positioned her crosshairs where she calculated he would appear next. When he emerged from behind a fruit vendor's stall, she was waiting. The bullet took him center mass, and he dropped the RPG launcher as he fell. The weapon skittered across the dusty ground, now useless to his comrades. "RPG threat neutralized," she reported, already searching for the next target. Miller had counted 6 fighters in that group, which meant 5 were still out there somewhere. As if reading her thoughts, he pointed toward a building near the edge of the market area. Movement in the doorway of the blue shop. "Looks like they're regrouping." Santos shifted her aim to the new location. Through her scope, she could see several figures in the shadowy interior of what appeared to be a small store. They were gesturing animatedly, probably arguing about their next move after losing their RPG gunner. One of them stepped into the doorway, providing Santos with a partial target. It wasn't a perfect shot. Only his shoulder and part of his torso were visible, but it was enough. She sent another round downrange, and the figure stumbled backward into the building. The psychological effect of accurate sniper fire was often as important as the physical casualties. Enemy fighters quickly learned that exposing themselves anywhere in the village meant risking instant death from an unseen shooter. It forced them to be more cautious, which slowed down their attacks and gave the Americans more time. But Santos knew this advantage wouldn't last long. The enemy fighters would adapt, just as she had to adapt to their tactics. Soon they would start using smoke grenades to obscure her vision or coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm her ability to engage all the threats. Miller confirmed her concerns a moment later. "Smoke grenades going off in 3 locations. They're trying to blind us." Thick white smoke began billowing up from several points around the village, creating a haze that would make long-range shooting much more difficult. Santos adjusted her scope settings and continued scanning for targets, but the smoke was already affecting her visibility. "Helicopter inbound in 8 minutes, Rodriguez announced over the radio. "We need that landing zone clear." The landing zone was a flat area just north of the convoy position. From Santos's elevated position, she could see that several buildings overlooked the proposed helicopter landing site. If enemy fighters got into those buildings with rifles or RPGs, they could easily shoot down the medical evacuation helicopter. Miller, scan those buildings north of the LZ, she said. We need to make sure they're clear before the bird arrives. As Miller adjusted his position to observe the landing zone area, Santos continued engaging targets of opportunity through the smoke. A muzzle flash from a building to the east caught her attention. Someone was firing at the convoy from a second-story window. She couldn't see the shooter clearly through the smoke, but she could estimate his position based on the muzzle flash. Santos aimed at the center of the window and fired 3 rounds in quick succession, spacing them across the opening. The return fire from that position stopped immediately. Nice shooting, Miller said. But we've got a bigger problem developing. Large group of fighters moving in from the east. They're using the smoke as cover, but I count at least 10 individuals. Santos felt a cold knot form in her stomach. 10 fighters was more than she could engage effectively, especially if they attacked simultaneously from multiple directions. Her rifle held 5 rounds in the magazine, and while she could reload quickly, there would be gaps in her coverage. Rodriguez, be advised, large enemy force approaching from the east. Estimate 10+ individuals. You need to be ready for a coordinated attack on your position. Copy that. All units, prepare for incoming assault. Conserve ammunition and wait for clear targets. Santos began making the tactical calculations that would determine how to best use her remaining ammunition. The fighters approaching from the east were still several minutes away, giving her time to engage the most dangerous threats first. But she would have to choose her targets carefully. Through the smoke, she caught a glimpse of someone moving on a rooftop near the landing zone. The figure was carrying what looked like an RPG launcher, positioning himself to ambush the incoming helicopter. This was exactly the kind of threat that could turn a routine medical evacuation into a disaster. Priority target on the rooftop near LZ, she announced. Individual with RPG, moving into position to engage the helicopter. The target was partially obscured by the smoke, but Santos could make out his general outline. The range was about 300 meters, well within her effective engagement distance. She adjusted for the wind and smoke effects, then steadied her breathing as she prepared to take the shot. The fighter paused at the edge of the rooftop, probably trying to get a better view of the approaching helicopter through the smoke. It was the opening Santos needed. She placed her crosshairs on his center mass and squeezed the trigger. Through the smoke, she saw the figure spin and collapse. The RPG launcher fell from the rooftop and clattered onto the street below, breaking apart on impact. Threat to LZ eliminated, she reported, working the bolt to chamber another round. But even as she engaged that target, Miller was calling out new threats developing in other areas. The enemy was adapting to her presence, using the smoke to mask their movements while they maneuvered into better positions. Multiple contacts moving through the eastern buildings, Miller said. They're getting close to effective range of our position. Santos realized with growing concern that she was facing a coordinated attack designed specifically to neutralize her Overwatch position. The enemy had figured out where she was shooting from and was moving to either eliminate her or force her to relocate. The helicopter's distinctive rotor noise was becoming audible in the distance. In 5 minutes, it would be landing in the middle of what was rapidly becoming a major firefight. Santos had to clear the remaining threats before then, or the medical evacuation would turn into a death trap for everyone involved. She returned to her scope and began the most challenging shooting of her military career. The enemy was closing in, the smoke was getting thicker, and time was running out. The first rounds aimed at Santos's position struck the rocks 3 feet to her left. The sharp crack of incoming fire made both her and Miller instinctively flatten against the ground as stone chips scattered around them. "They've found us," Miller said, pressing himself lower against the hillside. Incoming fire from multiple positions in the village. Santos kept her eye pressed to the rifle scope, scanning for muzzle flashes that would reveal the enemy shooters' positions. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, she could see brief sparks of light from several buildings as fighters opened fire on her overwatch position. More bullets struck nearby, some passing close enough that she could hear their distinctive whip-crack sound. The enemy had clearly identified her location and was now trying to suppress her fire with concentrated shooting from multiple positions. It was a smart tactical move that would force her to keep her head down instead of engaging targets. But Santos had been in similar situations before. During urban combat training, instructors had taught her that snipers under fire had two choices: relocate immediately or fight back aggressively. Since the convoy below needed her continued support, relocation wasn't really an option. She identified the closest muzzle flash and fired a quick shot in return. The incoming fire from that position stopped immediately, though she couldn't confirm whether she had hit the shooter or simply forced him to take cover. Helicopter 2 minutes out, Rodriguez announced over the radio. His voice carried the stress of a commander watching his situation deteriorate rapidly. Landing zone is taking fire. We need immediate suppression of enemy positions. Santos looked toward the proposed landing area and saw puffs of dust where bullets were striking the ground. Several enemy fighters had positioned themselves to engage the helicopter as soon as it tried to land. The medical evacuation was walking into a carefully prepared ambush. "Miller, I need target locations for the LZ threats," she said, working the bolt to chamber another round. Her spotter raised his head cautiously above the rocks, using his binoculars to scan the area around the landing zone. Almost immediately, more shots rang out as enemy fighters spotted his movement. "Building with the green door, second floor window," he called out. "Also getting fire from the white building, rooftop level." Santos swung her rifle toward the green door, building first. Through her scope, she could see a figure moving behind the second floor window. The shooter was being careful to stay mostly concealed, but snipers learned to watch for the small details that revealed hidden targets. She waited patiently, knowing that sooner or later he would have to expose himself to get a clear shot at the landing zone. When he leaned out slightly to adjust his firing position, Santos was ready. Her bullet shattered the window frame, and the figure disappeared from view. The white building presented a more challenging target. The rooftop position offered the shooter excellent cover and concealment, making it difficult for Santos to get a clear shot. But it also gave the enemy fighter a perfect view of where the helicopter would land. She studied the rooftop through her scope, looking for any movement or exposed position. After 30 seconds of careful observation, she spotted a small section of the enemy fighter's rifle barrel protruding past the edge of a ventilation unit on the roof. It was an extremely difficult shot. Santos would have to hit a target she couldn't actually see by aiming at the rifle barrel and calculating where the shooter's body would be positioned behind it. The margin for error was almost zero. She took extra time with this shot, adjusting her scope settings and reading the wind conditions carefully. The helicopter noise was getting louder, which meant she had less than a minute before it would be in the enemy fighter's engagement range. Santos placed her crosshairs just above where she estimated the rifle barrel met the enemy fighter's shoulder. She controlled her breathing, waited for the wind to settle, and squeezed the trigger steadily. Through her scope, she saw the rifle barrel jerk upward and then disappear behind the ventilation unit. Whether she had hit the shooter or just his weapon, the threat to the landing zone from that position was eliminated. "LZ threats suppressed," she reported. "Helicopter clear to land." But even as she spoke, new problems were developing. The large group of enemy fighters Miller had spotted earlier was now close enough to engage the convoy directly. Santos could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as they opened fire on the American soldiers trapped below. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the valley as both sides engaged in a fierce firefight. Santos could hear the distinctive rattle of M4 rifles mixed with the sharper crack of AK-47s. The battle was intensifying just as the helicopter was arriving to evacuate the wounded. Through her scope, Santos began engaging the eastern group of fighters systematically. She identified individual targets and eliminated them one by one, but new shooters seemed to appear as quickly as she could neutralize the existing ones. A bullet struck the rock inches from her face, sending stone fragments into her cheek. The enemy was getting more accurate with their return fire, making her position increasingly dangerous. But she maintained her focus, continuing to provide overwatch for the soldiers below. The helicopter appeared over the ridge to the north, its rotors beating loudly as it approached the landing zone. The pilot was flying low and fast, trying to minimize his exposure to enemy fire. But Santos could see that several fighters had repositioned themselves to engage the aircraft as soon as it slowed down to land. Incoming fire on the helicopter, Miller shouted over the noise of rotor blades and gunfire. Santos watched through her scope as tracers streaked up toward the aircraft from multiple positions around the village. The helicopter pilot banked sharply to avoid the incoming fire, but he still needed to land to evacuate the wounded soldiers. She identified the closest threat to the aircraft and fired quickly. The tracers from that position stopped immediately, but there were still other fighters shooting at the helicopter, and she couldn't engage them all simultaneously. The helicopter pilot was incredibly skilled, using the terrain and buildings to mask his approach while dodging enemy fire. He brought the aircraft down toward the landing zone in a steep, spiraling descent that made it a difficult target for the enemy fighters. Santos continued providing cover fire, engaging any target that revealed itself while shooting at the helicopter. Her rifle was running low on ammunition, but she had to maintain suppressive fire until the medical evacuation was complete. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Almost immediately, soldiers from the convoy began moving the wounded toward the aircraft while others provided covering fire. The entire operation would take less than 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes would determine whether the evacuation succeeded or turned into a disaster. Enemy fire intensified as the fighters realized this was their best opportunity to inflict maximum casualties on the Americans. Santos could see multiple muzzle flashes from buildings around the landing zone as they concentrated their fire on the helicopter and the soldiers exposed in the open ground. She fired as rapidly as accuracy allowed, engaging targets in order of priority based on their threat to the evacuation. A fighter with an RPG launcher took precedence over rifle-armed opponents. Positions with clear shots at the helicopter were more important than those firing at soldiers in cover. One of her shots sparked off the RPG launcher just as the enemy fighter was preparing to fire. The weapon spun out of his hands and clattered down the building's exterior staircase. The fighter dove for cover as Santos worked her bolt and searched for the next target. The helicopter's engines were revving up as the wounded soldiers were loaded aboard. Santos could see the medical personnel working frantically to secure the casualties while door gunners returned fire at enemy positions around the village. But she also noticed something else that made her blood run cold. A new group of fighters was approaching the landing zone from the north, moving through a section of the village that had appeared empty earlier. They were carrying automatic weapons and at least one RPG launcher, positioning themselves for a devastating attack on the helicopter as it tried to take off. New contacts north of LZ, she announced urgently. Multiple fighters with heavy weapons moving into position. Santos swung her rifle toward this new threat, knowing that she was running dangerously low on ammunition. She had perhaps 3 or 4 rounds left in her current magazine, with only one spare magazine remaining. Against a coordinated attack by a dozen or more enemy fighters, that wouldn't be nearly enough. The helicopter was starting to lift off, its rotors beating frantically as the pilot tried to gain altitude and speed. But it was still vulnerable for the next 30 seconds while it climbed out of the landing zone and accelerated away from the village. Santos acquired her first target from a northern group and fired. The fighter dropped his rifle and fell backward behind a low wall. She worked the bolt and found her next target, a man carrying the RPG launcher who was trying to get into position for a shot at the climbing helicopter. This was the most critical shot of the entire engagement. If that RPG found its mark, the helicopter and everyone aboard would be killed instantly. Santos had one chance to stop the attack before the fighter could bring his weapon to bear. She placed her crosshairs on the RPG gunner's center mass and began her trigger squeeze, knowing that everything now depended on this single shot. The RPG gunner was raising his launcher to his shoulder when Santos's bullet found its mark. The impact spun him around and sent the rocket-propelled grenade flying harmlessly into the air before detonating against a hillside 200 meters away. The explosion echoed through the valley like thunder. RPG threat neutralized, Santos reported, working her bolt to chamber what she knew was her last round in this magazine. The helicopter was gaining altitude and speed, but wasn't clear of danger yet. Santos could see more enemy fighters moving into positions where they could engage the aircraft with small arms fire. Even rifle bullets could bring down a helicopter if they hit critical components or crew members. Through her scope, she tracked a fighter who was climbing onto a rooftop with what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. This weapon would be devastating against the helicopter, which was still within effective range. Santos had to stop him before he could set up his weapon. She fired her last round and watched the target drop from sight behind the rooftop wall. Whether he was dead or simply wounded didn't matter. The immediate threat was eliminated. Santos quickly reloaded her rifle with her final magazine. 5 rounds left. She had to make each shot count because there would be no opportunity to resupply until the immediate crisis was over. The helicopter was now several hundred meters away and climbing rapidly, but enemy fighters were still trying to engage it with long-range fire. Santos could see tracers reaching up toward the aircraft, though most were falling short as the helicopter moved beyond effective rifle range. Medical evacuation successful, Rodriguez announced over the radio. Wounded are airborne and en route to the field hospital. But Santos knew their situation was far from resolved. The enemy fighters who had failed to stop the helicopter were now turning their attention back to the convoy, trapped below. She could see them repositioning themselves for what would probably be a final coordinated assault on the American ground forces. "Miller, what's our ammunition status?" she asked while scanning for new targets. "I've got 3 magazines left for my rifle," he replied, "plus 2 grenades. What about you?" 5 rounds in the sniper rifle, then I'm down to my sidearm. It wasn't much firepower to hold off a determined attack by what appeared to be 20 or more enemy fighters. Santos realized she would have to change her tactics from precision shooting to psychological warfare, using her remaining ammunition to create maximum disruption among the enemy forces. The smoke from the earlier grenades was beginning to dissipate, giving her clearer views of the village below. She could see fighters moving between buildings, apparently organizing for their next attack. Several groups were converging on positions that would allow them to engage the convoy from multiple directions simultaneously. Santos identified what appeared to be a leader figure directing the movement of other fighters near the center of the village. He was pointing toward different positions and appeared to be coordinating the attack. Taking out a leader could disrupt their organization and buy the convoy more time. She aimed carefully and fired, watching the figure drop behind a stone wall. Whether he was killed or wounded, his apparent leadership role in the attack was finished. With 4 rounds remaining, Santos had to choose her targets extremely carefully. She looked for fighters carrying heavy weapons, those in positions to cause maximum damage to the convoy, and anyone who appeared to be directing the activities of others. A fighter emerged from a building carrying what looked like a rocket launcher. Santos eliminated him with her next shot. Another fighter was setting up what appeared to be a mortar behind a low wall. She stopped him before he could complete his preparations. 2 rounds left. The enemy was beginning to understand that they were facing an extremely capable sniper who was picking off their most dangerous elements. Santos could see them becoming more cautious, using better cover and concealment as they moved. But this caution also slowed down their attack, which worked in favor of the Americans. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with new information. "All units, be advised that close air support is en route." F-16s will be on station in 12 minutes with precision munitions. 12 minutes. Santos had to keep the enemy from overrunning the convoy position for 12 more minutes. With only 2 rounds left in her rifle, she would have to rely on psychological warfare and careful target selection to maintain the initiative. She spotted a group of 4 fighters moving together toward a building that would give them excellent firing positions against the convoy. Rather than shoot one of them, Santos aimed at a fuel barrel near their position and fired. The barrel exploded in a ball of orange flame, forcing the fighters to scatter and seek new cover. 1 round expended, but for enemies disrupted. It was an efficient use of her limited ammunition. Santos chambered her final rifle round and began looking for the most critical targets she could find. This shot had to count more than any other because after this she would be down to her M9 pistol for long-range engagement. Through her scope, she saw a fighter setting up what looked like a large mortar in a courtyard near the center of the village. The weapon would have the range and explosive power to devastate the convoy position. This was clearly the most dangerous remaining threat. The range was nearly 400 meters, at the outer limit of her effective shooting distance. The target was partially concealed behind equipment and debris. Santos would get only 1 chance to eliminate this threat. She took extra time with her final rifle shot, reading the wind conditions carefully and adjusting her scope settings for the maximum range engagement. The mortar gunner was focused on his weapon setup and hadn't noticed the sniper observing him from a hillside. Santos controlled her breathing and began her trigger squeeze. The rifle cracked for the last time, and she watched through the scope as her bullet found its target. The mortar gunner collapsed over his weapon, eliminating the most serious remaining threat to the convoy. Sniper rifle ammunition exhausted, she reported. Switching to secondary weapon, Santos set aside the empty sniper rifle and drew her M9 pistol. The handgun was accurate enough for close-range defensive work, but it wouldn't be effective against targets at the distances she had been engaging. Her role was about to change from offensive sniper to defensive fighter. Miller continued spotting targets and calling out enemy movements while Santos prepared for what might be a last stand. They had bought time for the medical evacuation and eliminated many of the most dangerous threats, but the enemy still had superior numbers and was closing in on their position. Multiple contacts moving up the hillside toward our position, Miller announced. They're trying to flank us from the west. Santos looked in the direction Miller indicated and could see several fighters climbing the rocky slopes toward their overwatch position. They had apparently decided that eliminating the sniper was worth the risk of exposing themselves to climb the hillside. She estimated the distance at about 200 meters and closing. Her pistol would be effective at that range, but not against multiple moving targets. Santos realized they might have to abandon their position soon or risk being overrun. But abandoning their overwatch position would leave the convoy below completely exposed to enemy fire. The soldiers down there were counting on continued sniper support to keep the enemy suppressed until air support arrived. Santos made a tactical decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of retreating to a safer position, she and Miller would hold their ground and fight from here. They would use every advantage the terrain provided and make the enemy pay dearly for every meter of ground they gained. She checked her pistol ammunition and prepared for close-quarters combat. 10 rounds a magazine, plus 2 spare magazines. Not much, but it would have to be enough to hold off the enemy for the next few minutes until the F-16s arrived with their precision weapons. The sound of approaching enemy fighters echoed off the rocky hillside as they climbed towards Santos's position. In a few moments, the long-range sniper engagement would become a desperate close-quarters battle for survival. The first enemy fighter appeared on the rocky ledge 30 meters below Santos's position. He was breathing hard from the climb and moving cautiously, clearly aware that he was approaching a dangerous opponent. Santos waited until he committed to his next movement before engaging him with her pistol. The 9mm rounds echoed sharply off the surrounding rocks as Santos fired 3 quick shots. The fighter stumbled and fell backward off the ledge, his rifle clattering down the hillside after him. But she could hear more voices approaching from different directions as his comrades continued their assault. "Contact right," Miller called out, firing his M4 rifle at targets approaching from another angle. 3 individuals climbing the eastern approach. Santos shifted position to support Miller's engagement, while keeping watch on the western route, where she had just eliminated the first attacker. The rocky terrain provided excellent defensive positions, but it also offered multiple routes for attackers to approach their location. She caught sight of movement behind a boulder 15 meters away and fired 2 shots in that direction. The movement stopped, though she couldn't confirm whether she had hit anything or simply forced the enemy to take cover. Miller's rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged the group approaching from the east. "Got one," he reported. 2 still moving up. Santos could hear radio chatter from the convoy below as Rodriguez coordinated the ground defense while waiting for air support. The F-16s were still several minutes away, but their arrival would change the tactical situation completely. A grenade exploded 20 meters to Santos's left, showering the area with rock fragments and dust. The enemy was using grenades to force the American snipers out of their defensive positions. Santos and Miller pressed themselves flat against the rocks as more explosions followed. "They're trying to flush us out," Miller said. "We need to relocate." But relocating would mean abandoning their overwatch of the convoy, potentially allowing enemy forces to overrun the American position below. Santos made the decision to hold their ground despite the increasing danger. "We stay here," she said firmly. "The convoy needs our support." Another grenade exploded closer to their position, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire as enemy fighters tried to advance during the confusion. Santos emerged from cover and fired rapidly at the approaching threats, forcing them to dive for protection behind the scattered boulders. Through the dust and smoke, she could see at least 4 enemy fighters positioned within 50 meters of their location. They were well-armed and using good tactical movement, clearly experienced fighters who understood how to assault a defensive position. Miller fired a grenade from his M203 launcher, sending the explosive round toward a group of fighters clustered behind a large rock formation. The explosion scattered them and bought a few precious seconds of breathing room. Santos's pistol was running low on ammunition. She had fired 8 rounds from her current magazine, leaving only 2 before she would need to reload. Every shot had to count now, because there might not be time for a magazine change if the enemy rushed their position simultaneously from multiple directions. She heard the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching from the north and felt a surge of relief. The F-16s were arriving earlier than expected, which meant precision airstrikes would soon be available to break up the enemy attack. "Close air support on station," Rodriguez announced over the radio, preparing to engage enemy positions in the village. The first air strike hit the center of the village with devastating effect. Santos felt the ground shake beneath her as the precision-guided munition detonated among the buildings where enemy fighters had been concentrating. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel supplies were ignited by the initial blast. The psychological effect on the enemy fighters was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated assault on the hillside position faltered as fighters looked back toward the village where their comrades were being destroyed by American air power. Santos seized the opportunity to advance against the confused enemy fighters. She moved quickly from her defensive position toward the nearest group of attackers, engaging them with her pistol at close range. The element of surprise, combined with the shock of the airstrikes, gave her a crucial advantage. One fighter was reloading his rifle when Santos appeared from behind a boulder. She eliminated him with 2 quick shots before he could bring his weapon to bear. Another fighter tried to flee down the hillside, but stumbled on the loose rocks, giving Santos an easy target. Miller was advancing from the other direction, his M4 rifle cutting down enemy fighters who were too focused on the airstrikes to maintain proper defensive awareness. Within minutes, the immediate threat to their Overwatch position was eliminated. More airstrikes hammered the village below as the F-16s systematically destroyed enemy strongholds and weapons positions. Santos could see fighters abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the surrounding desert, their organized resistance collapsing under the precision bombardment. Enemy forces retreating from the village, Rodriguez reported. Immediate threat to convoy eliminated. Santos and Miller returned to their Overwatch position and began assessing the aftermath of the engagement. The village of Al-Rashid was largely destroyed, with smoke rising from multiple buildings that had been struck by air-to-ground missiles. The surviving enemy fighters were scattered across the desert, no longer capable of organized resistance. Final count on confirmed kills, Miller asked, retrieving his binoculars to observe the withdrawal of enemy forces. Santos thought back through the engagement, calculating the targets she had eliminated during the various phases of the battle. The machine gunner on the white building, the RPG fighter in the market, several others during the assault on their position. 11 confirmed from the sniper rifle, plus 3 more with the pistol, she replied. It had been one of the most intense engagements of her military career, requiring every skill she had developed through years of training and previous combat experience. But, more importantly, her accurate shooting had prevented the enemy from overrunning the convoy or shooting down the medical evacuation helicopter. Recovery vehicles arrived within an hour to retrieve the damaged convoy and evacuate the remaining personnel. Santos packed her equipment methodically, checking each component for damage from the rock fragments and near-miss explosions she had endured. As they prepared to leave the hillside Overwatch position, Captain Rodriguez climbed up to personally thank the sniper team for their performance during the engagement. "Outstanding work up here," he said, surveying the battlefield below. "That medical evacuation would have been impossible without your support. Those wounded soldiers owe their lives to your shooting." Santos accepted the praise with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire military career. She had done her job effectively under extremely difficult conditions, proving once again that skill and determination mattered more than prejudice or preconceptions about who belonged in combat roles. During the helicopter flight back to base, Santos reflected on the lessons learned from the engagement. The enemy had been well organized and tactically sound, using terrain and weather conditions to their advantage. But they had underestimated the effectiveness of accurate long-range fire in disrupting their plans. Most importantly, the engagement had demonstrated the value of maintaining calm professionalism under extreme pressure. When bullets were flying and explosions were shaking the ground, technical skills and tactical knowledge had to be applied with precision and confidence. Back at the forward operating base, Santos cleaned and maintained her rifle while writing her after-action report. The M24 had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, delivering accurate fire at ranges from 100 to 400 meters despite the challenging environmental conditions. The official debriefing would come later, along with the inevitable paperwork and analysis that followed every significant combat engagement. But Santos already knew that this battle would be remembered as one of the most successful sniper operations of the deployment. News of the engagement spread quickly through the military community. A female sniper had held off a coordinated enemy assault, eliminated multiple high-value targets, and enabled a successful medical evacuation under fire. It was the kind of performance that changed perceptions and opened doors for other women seeking combat roles. For Santos, however, the recognition was less important than the knowledge that she had done her job when it mattered most. Her fellow soldiers had trusted her to provide overwatch and protection, and she had delivered when their lives depended on her skills. 3 weeks later, Santos was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation specifically mentioned her elimination of 14 enemy combatants during a 4-hour engagement, her protection of a medical evacuation helicopter, and her successful defense of an overwatch position against coordinated assault. But the medal was just a symbol. The real reward was the respect of her peers, and the knowledge that when the situation had been most desperate, when her unit had been pinned down by enemy fire and, facing overwhelming odds, she had picked off the threats one by one until victory was achieved.